In April 1945, in a German U-boat hiding 200 meters beneath the cold gray water of the North Atlantic, a captain heard a sound he had been trained to dread. It was not an explosion. It was not the rumble of a destroyer's screws. It was something stranger and more intimate, a faint, steady, mechanical pulse, a ping. He did not know where it came from. He did not need to. The pulse meant that somewhere on the surface above him, a ship had found him. The water that was supposed to hide him was no longer hiding him. The dark was no longer dark. And in the few minutes that remained before the depth charges began to fall, the captain would do everything he had been trained to do: change course, dive deeper, slow to silent running, release decoys, and none of it would work. Because the men on the surface could hear him through the steel. They could hear him through the water. They could hear him through the layers of cold ocean that had hidden submarines for the entire previous war. In the operational reports that German commanders were writing back to Kriegsmarine headquarters by the spring of 1943, the language is carefully professional. The Allied detection capability is described as extremely accurate. The U-boat losses are reported as unsustainable. The technical recommendations are practical and precise. But underneath the professional language, in the gaps between the technical assessments, there is a different tone, something closer to bewilderment, something almost superstitious. Their boats were dying for reasons that physics, as they understood it, could not explain. The technology that was killing them had been built by a small company in Boston, a company that 30 decades earlier had been making bells, not sophisticated weapons, not classified electronics, bells. Iron bells lowered into the water near lighthouses, ringing in the fog so that ships approaching the coast would not run aground in the dark. This is the story of how that small Boston Bell Company became the most lethal anti-submarine technology supplier in the world, and how their work changed the math of an ocean war that, until 1943, the Germans had been winning.
The Submarine Signal Company occupied a building on Atlantic Avenue in Boston. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was, a modest industrial concern in a port city, surrounded by the working machinery of New England's maritime economy. Inside, in 1901, a small team of engineers was solving an extremely old problem. The problem was fog. Coastal navigation in the early 20th century had not fundamentally changed in centuries. Captains used charts, lights, and lead lines. They watched for landmarks. In clear weather, the system worked. In fog, which on the New England coast can roll in within minutes and reduce visibility to a few feet, the system failed catastrophically. Ships ran onto rocks. Ships collided with each other. Ships disappeared. The economic cost of fog was enormous, and the human cost was greater still. Lighthouses helped, but lighthouses depend on being seen. The Submarine Signal Company's idea was to give ships something they could hear instead. They built bells, large iron bells, mechanically struck and lowered them beneath the surface of the water near hazards. Lighthouses got bells, light ships got bells, buoys marking dangerous shoals got bells, and the company designed receivers, hydrophones essentially, mounted on the hulls of ships that could pick up the sound of those bells from miles away through the water. The physics of this idea was elegantly simple. Sound travels nearly 5 times faster in water than in air. It travels farther. It is less affected by weather, by atmospheric conditions, by the thousands small variables that make air-based fog signals unreliable. 2 microphones mounted on either side of a ship's hull allowed for binaural detection. The direction of the bell could be determined precisely. According to a 1907 Admiralty report, the system extended the effective range of a fog signal until it approximately equaled the visible range of a lightship's lamp in clear weather. For ships approaching Boston Harbor, the company's installations allowed navigators to determine their position from 10 to 12 miles out, well clear of the dangerous shoals at the harbor mouth. By 1912, the Submarine Signal Company had installed more than 100 bell arrays along coastlines in North America, Europe, and Asia. By 1919, that number had grown to more than 150. By 1920, more than 2,000 merchant ships and over 1,000 naval vessels around the world carried submarine signal receivers. Business was steady. The technology worked. And then, on the night of April 14, 1912, an iceberg in the North Atlantic killed more than 1,500 people aboard a passenger steamer named Titanic, and the company's quiet maritime safety business was forced into a question that would change the world. If you can hear a bell underwater from 12 miles away, can you also hear an iceberg?
Reginald Aubrey Fessenden was Canadian, born in Quebec in 1866 and educated at Bishop's College. He had spent the early part of his career working with Edison Machine Works and then with the United States Weather Bureau. By 1900, he had become one of the most accomplished radio engineers in the world. On Christmas Eve 1906, broadcasting from a transmitter in Massachusetts, he had performed what is generally credited as the first audio-radio broadcast in history. Ships' wireless operators along the Atlantic coast, expecting Morse code, instead heard a man playing a violin and reading from the Bible. They thought they had lost their minds. By 1912, Fessenden had made and lost a fortune in the American radio industry, fallen out with his investors, and was looking for new work. The Submarine Signal Company hired him as a consulting engineer. The official assignment was modest: improve the receivers used in the bell system. The bells worked, but the hydrophones picking them up were primitive, susceptible to interference from the ship's own engines, and limited in directional accuracy. Fessenden took the assignment and quietly violated its terms. He had been hired to improve a receiver. What he built instead was a transmitter, and not just any transmitter. He built a device that could both produce sound underwater and receive its echo: the Fessenden oscillator. A 1,200-pound steel cylinder containing a hollow copper tube wrapped tightly with electrical windings, terminating in a steel plate that flexed at 540 Hz when alternating current ran through the coils. It looked like a heavy industrial loudspeaker. It functioned, depending on which way the current flowed, as either an underwater horn or an underwater microphone, or both, alternately, with the operator simply switching the circuit. This was the heresy. The bells of the Submarine Signal Company were passive devices. They sat in fixed positions and made noise that other ships listened for. Fessenden's oscillator was active. A ship carrying it could send a sound out into the water, listen for it to come back, and from the time delay calculate the distance to whatever the sound had bounced off. He had reinvented the principle that bats use to fly in the dark. He had built the first practical sonar. In January 1914, in Boston Harbor, on a tugboat called the Susie D, submarine signal engineer Robert Williams demonstrated underwater Morse code transmission using the oscillator. Two ships, separated by water, exchanged messages without a wire between them. In March of that same year, Fessenden took the device aboard the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Miami and sailed for the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, the same waters where the Titanic had gone down 2 years earlier. There, in fog and freezing seas, he demonstrated three things. He measured the depth of the seafloor by echo. He sent and received Morse code through the water. And he detected an iceberg by its echo at a range of 2 miles. The implications were enormous, and the company that owned the patent was, by Fessenden's own bitter account, slow to understand them. Submarine Signal focused on selling oscillators as upgraded fog warning devices. They sold them to the Allies. They sold them until the United States entered the First World War in 1917, also to the Central Powers. Fessenden, a British loyalist, was furious. The technology that had been born to prevent another Titanic disaster was, by 1915, being installed on Royal Navy K-class submarines for an entirely different purpose. The Bell Company had become a weapons company, almost by accident, and the weapon was sound. The First World War ended before Fessenden's invention could fully transform anti-submarine warfare. Between the wars, work continued slowly.
The Submarine Signal Company refined the oscillator and developed something they called the fathometer, a depth-sounding device they trademarked, which became standard equipment on commercial ships worldwide. The Royal Navy, drawing on parallel work by their own scientists, developed an active sonar system they called ASDIC. The U.S. Navy, working through the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington and the Bureau of Ships, developed equipment they called Sonar. The two systems were essentially the same idea. By 1939, both countries had operational anti-submarine sonar deployed on a small number of warships. A small number was the problem. When the Second World War began on the 1st of September 1939, the United States Navy possessed exactly 60 destroyers equipped with anti-submarine devices. By December 1941, when Germany declared war on the United States, that number had grown to 170. It was, by the standards of what was about to happen, almost nothing. What was about to happen was Operation Drumbeat. On January 13, 1942, 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, 6 weeks after the German declaration of war, Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German U-boat force, sent 18 submarines across the Atlantic to attack American shipping along the eastern seaboard. He sent 18. He could probably have sent more, but 18 was what he had ready. It was enough. The American coast in early 1942 was a target-rich environment that bordered on the absurd. Coastal cities were not blacked out. The lights of New York and Atlantic City and Miami silhouetted merchant ships against the night sky for U-boat captains looking through their periscopes from international waters. There was no convoy system. Tankers and freighters sailed alone, on regular schedules, on predictable routes, illuminated against the shore. The U.S. Navy, accustomed to thinking of submarine warfare as something that happened in the Atlantic between Britain and Europe, was not prepared. Coastal patrols were thin, air cover was inadequate, communications between civilian and military shipping were chaotic. In the first 8 months of 1942, German U-boats sank approximately 500 Allied ships off the U.S. coast. They sank them within sight of beaches. They sank them in the Gulf of Mexico. They sank them along the entire Atlantic seaboard from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. They killed more than 5,000 merchant seamen and naval personnel, twice the death toll of Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Navy lied to the public about the scale of the disaster, and the news media agreed to government censorship to protect the cover-up. In June 1942, at the peak of the carnage, the Allies lost 124 ships in a single month, 830,000 tons of shipping. Roughly 4 ships sunk every day. The German U-boat captains called it the American shooting season. Dönitz called it the second happy time. By the time it ended in August 1942, the Germans had sunk roughly a quarter of all the shipping they would sink in the entire war, for the loss of just 22 U-boats. 26 American ships sunk for every U-boat lost. The math was catastrophic, and the Atlantic was on the verge of being closed. Something had to change, and the company that had once made bells was about to provide the change. By 1943, the technology that emerged from the marriage of submarine signal company expertise, Naval Research Laboratory science, and the urgent industrial mobilization of the American war machine was qualitatively different from anything the Germans had encountered before. The basic principle was the same one Fessenden had demonstrated 30 years earlier. A transducer mounted in a steel dome under the hull of a destroyer or destroyer escort sent out a directional pulse of sound at high frequency. By the end of the war, the standard American scanning sonar operated at 18 kHz using arrays of ammonium dihydrogen phosphate crystals as the active acoustic element. The pulse traveled through the water at roughly 1,500 meters per second. If it struck the steel hull of a submerged submarine, it bounced back. The same transducer switched to receive mode picked up the echo. The time delay between transmission and echo gave the range. The bearing of the transducer at the moment of the echo gave the direction. From those two pieces of information, the position of the U-boat could be calculated within a few yards. What made the American implementation lethal in 1943 was not the principle, it was the integration. Earlier sonar had been operated by a single specialist with a headset, manually rotating the transducer through arcs of 45 degrees and listening for echoes that he had to distinguish from biological noise, water layers, and his own ship's machinery. By 1943, the new American destroyer escorts were rolling out of shipyards equipped with what was called a Combat Information Center, a dedicated compartment separate from the bridge in which sonar operators, radar operators, plotters, and weapons coordinators worked together as a single integrated team. The captain ran the ship from the bridge, the CIC ran the hunt. The sonar models the Submarine Signal Company contributed to, the QC, the QGB, the smaller QJB designed specifically for destroyer escorts, were searchlight-type sonars, requiring deliberate manual steering. But the men working them had been trained, in many cases, on the company's older systems and on simulators built for that specific purpose. They knew the difference between an echo from a U-boat and an echo from a school of fish. They knew how thermal layers in the water deflected acoustic pulses and how to compensate. They knew how to maintain a contact while the ship maneuvered, and they knew how to coordinate with the radar room when a U-boat surfaced to recharge its batteries at night. The detection range was, in good conditions, around 1,500 yards. That number by itself does not sound dramatic. It is the distance from one end of a long city block to the other. But 1,500 yards underwater in 1943 was an eternity. It meant that a destroyer pinging in a search pattern around a convoy could pick up a U-boat at the periphery, hold the contact while turning to attack, and bring weapons to bear before the submarine commander could even understand what was happening. It meant that the cover of darkness, which had served U-boat tactics throughout the previous 3 years, was no longer cover. A surfaced U-boat could be detected by radar. A submerged U-boat could be detected by sonar. The window of safety, which had once been hours, had narrowed to seconds. And inside those seconds, something else was waiting. The depth charge had been the standard anti-submarine weapon since the First World War, a barrel of explosive dropped from the stern of a warship as it passed over a contact, set to detonate at a chosen depth. It worked, sometimes. The fundamental problem was that depth charges had to be dropped behind the ship, which meant the ship had to pass directly over the U-boat, and as it passed, sonar contact was lost. The submarine became invisible at the very moment the attack began. A skilled U-boat commander, hearing the destroyer's screws change pitch as it accelerated overhead, could turn hard, dive deep, and often slip away. U-427, attacked in April 1945, survived 678 individual depth charges over the course of a single sustained engagement. The depth charge was a weapon of probability. You dropped enough of them and hoped one went off close enough. In 1942, the British Royal Navy's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a research outfit unofficially known as the Weasers and Dodgers, run by a chemist named Sir Charles Goodeve, solved the problem. The solution was called the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was a forward-throwing spigot mortar mounted on the foredeck of an escort vessel that fired 24 projectiles in a circular pattern roughly 250 meters ahead of the ship while sonar contact was still maintained. Each projectile carried 35 pounds of Torpex, an explosive considerably more powerful than TNT. Crucially, the projectiles were contact-fused. They did not explode unless they hit something. 23 quiet splashes and 1 sharp underwater detonation meant a kill. 24 quiet splashes meant the ship's sonar contact was unbroken. No underwater explosions had disturbed the water, and the attack could be repeated immediately. The first installation on a frigate-class destroyer escort was on HMS Bainton on March 12, 1943. The first U-boat killed by Hedgehog had gone down in November 1942. Initial success rates were modest, roughly 5%, because the weapon required precise targeting and the early crews were not trained for it. But by mid-1944, with the new combat information centers feeding sonar data directly to the Hedgehog crews, the success rate had transformed. In May 1944, the destroyer escort USS England, operating in the Pacific, sank 6 Japanese submarines in less than 2 weeks using Hedgehog. The weapon had become the most efficient submarine killer in the Allied arsenal. For a U-boat commander, the operational difference between the depth charge era and the Hedgehog era was the difference between being shot at and being executed. With depth charges, you knew you were under attack. The explosions were enormous, audible, terrifying, but they also told you when to evade. You waited for the screws to pass overhead, you turned hard, you dove. With Hedgehog, there were no explosions. The destroyer maintained contact at sonar range. 24 contact-fused bombs dropped silently into the water. If they missed, you heard nothing, and the next salvo was already loaded. If they hit, the U-boat hull cracked, water flooded the compartments, and the men inside drowned in the dark before they understood what had killed them. This was the weapon the Allies had married to the new American sonar by the spring of 1943, a detection system that could find a U-boat through the water and a delivery system that could kill it without warning. The two technologies, together, were the end of the U-boat war.
By April 1943, the German U-boat force had reached its peak operational strength. 220 boats were in service. 118 were at sea simultaneously. Donitz, working from his headquarters in occupied France, was directing Wolfpack operations against North Atlantic convoys with the same tactical confidence he had brought to the campaign for the previous 3 years. The numbers, on paper, looked good for Germany. The numbers, on paper, looked good right up until the first week of May. May 1943 entered the historical record under a single phrase, Black May. In 31 days, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 U-boats, more than they had lost in any previous month of the war. Convoy ONS-5 saw 13 merchant ships sunk, but at the cost of 6 U-boats, a kill ratio that, sustained over a year, would have wiped out the entire German submarine fleet. Convoys HX-237 and SC-129 each lost 3 merchant ships, but Allied escort groups sank 3 U-boats in each engagement. Convoy SC-130 lost no merchant ships and saw 3 U-boats sunk. Convoy HX-239 lost no merchant ships and saw 3 U-boats sunk. The exchange rate had inverted completely. Where in 1942 the Germans had been losing 1 boat for every 26 ships sunk, they were now losing more boats than they were sinking ships. On May 24, 1943, Karl Donitz withdrew the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic. In his memoir, written years later, he described the decision in language that, for a man of his position and temperament, was unusually direct. The Atlantic battle had been lost. Not lost in the sense of a temporary setback to be reversed by improved tactics or better weather. Lost in the sense of a fundamental shift in the underlying physics of the conflict. Something had changed in the equation, and his crews, the elite of the Kriegsmarine, men who had been the apex predators of the Atlantic for 3 years, were now the prey. The technical reports filed by surviving U-boat captains in the spring and summer of 1943 began to read differently from the operational reports of the previous war. Earlier reports had been clinical, professional, focused on tactical lessons that could be applied to future patrols. The 1943 reports retained the professional vocabulary, but the substance underneath was different. Captains described being detected at impossible ranges. They described being attacked from positions where the destroyers should not have been able to find them. They described diving below thermal layers that had reliably concealed them in 1942 and finding that the layers no longer concealed them. They described silent running at depths that had been safe a year earlier and being killed at those depths anyway. A few of the survivors used metaphors that, in the official reports, sat awkwardly beside the technical assessments. The Allied capability was described as uncanny, as if the ships above could see through the water, as if they could hear sounds that should not have been audible, as if they had access to information that physics and seamanship together could not account for. The sailors of the Kriegsmarine were professional, scientifically educated, ruthlessly trained. They were not given to superstition. And yet, in the gaps between their professional words, you can read a kind of operational helplessness that has the texture of the supernatural. The surface ships were finding them. The surface ships could not be eluded. The water no longer hid them. What had changed, of course, was not magic. It was a small Boston company that had been improving its bell receivers since 1901, and a war effort that had finally caught up with what the bell receivers had become.
The story of how the submarine signal company contributed to the defeat of the U-boat is often told as a story about a single piece of technology. It is more accurate to think of it as a story about an industry, a small, specialized, highly technical industry that had been quietly maturing in Boston for 40 years and that, when the war demanded it, was able to scale. By the early 1940s, the Submarine Signal Company employed roughly 250 people in its Atlantic Avenue facility. By 1943, the company was the sole supplier of echo-sounding and echo-ranging equipment to the United States Navy. That sentence, on its own, requires careful unpacking. The Naval Research Laboratory in Washington was responsible for much of the underlying scientific development. The Bureau of Ships set the requirements. MIT's Radiation Laboratory, established in late 1940, contributed to the radar systems that complemented sonar in the integrated detection picture. Other contractors built individual components, but when it came to the actual transducers, the steel and crystal devices that turned electricity into underwater sound and back again, there was one company in the country that had been doing the work for 40 years. The expansion was rapid and total. The Atlantic Avenue facility, designed for steady peacetime production of fog signal equipment, suddenly found itself responsible for outfitting hundreds of warships. Engineers who had spent their careers refining the fathometer were now designing tactical sonars for destroyer escorts that did not yet exist on the day they sat down to draw the schematics. The shop floors that had built bells for lighthouses were turning out QC and QGB and QJB sonar systems in numbers that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. The transducer technology itself evolved through the war. The first World War II operational sets used magnetostrictive transducers, nickel cores that vibrated when an electrical current passed through coils wrapped around them. Late war systems shifted to piezoelectric transducers built around ammonium dihydrogen phosphate crystals, packaged in steel tubes filled with castor oil and arranged in parallel arrays. These crystals, which had been laboratory curiosities a decade earlier, turned out to be remarkably efficient at converting electrical energy into precisely controlled sound at frequencies that had not been technically achievable with earlier materials. 18 kilohertz, the standard scanning frequency by 1945, was high enough to provide good directional precision and short enough wavelength to detect submarine-sized objects, while still low enough to avoid the worst absorption losses in seawater. What it added up to when the war ended was an industrial capability that nobody else in the world possessed. Britain had ASDIC and the science to support it. Germany had outstanding marine engineering. The Soviet Union had ambition. But the integrated system, the transducer technology, the manufacturing base, the trained operators, the doctrine, the data integration in the combat information centers existed at scale only in one place. And the heart of it was the research history, the patent portfolio, and the specialized expertise of a small Boston company that, in 1946, was acquired by Raytheon and folded into what became Raytheon's Marine Division. The Bell Company, having become a sonar company, became part of a defense conglomerate that would eventually build missile systems for the Cold War navies. But that absorption was the closing of a chapter that had begun, in a real sense, with the night of April 14, 1912, and the question that the loss of the Titanic had forced one small American industrial concern to ask. The question had been, can we make a noise loud enough to warn ships of icebergs they cannot see? The answer, after 30 years of patient engineering work, turned out to be yes, And we can also use the same noise to find anything else hiding underwater and to kill it before it knows we are there. Look at the entire arc of this story from a sufficient distance, and the strangest thing about it is not the technology, it is the trajectory of a company. In 1901, Submarine Signal Company existed because fog killed sailors, and somebody had to find a way to warn them. The ringing of an iron bell beneath the water near a lighthouse was a profoundly humane invention. It was designed to save lives. It was sold to lighthouse services, to merchant marine companies, to passenger lines whose customers wanted to be reasonably sure that their crossing of the Atlantic in fog would not end in collision with rocks. The men working on Atlantic Avenue in Boston in those years were not weapons engineers. They were engineers of safety. What changed them was the iceberg. The Titanic disaster in April 1912 shifted the underlying question. It was no longer enough to warn ships of fixed hazards in known positions. The future of marine safety required detecting hazards that were moving, drifting, hidden in water and weather. To answer that question, the company hired Reginald Fessenden, who built a device that could send a sound out and listen for its echo. He had built it for icebergs. The same physics that allowed it to find icebergs allowed it to find submarines. The same physics that allowed it to find submarines allowed Allied destroyers 3 decades later to track German U-boats through layered ocean and kill them with 24 contact-fused bombs dropped from a forward-throwing mortar in the dark. The German captains who survived to write their reports in 1943 reached, sometimes, for words like uncanny. They were not wrong. From the perspective of a submariner trained on the assumption that water hides what is in it, the new Allied capability was qualitatively different from anything that had come before. Their boats died for reasons their training had not prepared them to explain. Their captains, returning to base with damage they should not have taken, struggled to describe what had happened in language that did not sound, at the edges, like superstition. What had killed them was not magic, it was a piece of patient engineering work that had been improving in Boston since the year 1901, that had been forced into a more ambitious form by an iceberg in 1912, that had been turned into a weapon by the demands of a world war, and that it reached, by May 1943, the level of operational capability where the Atlantic was no longer the sea the Kriegsmarine had been winning. The Bell Company had become, by the long, slow accumulation of ordinary technical work, the company that ended the U-boat war. There is a question worth sitting with. In 1901, the engineers in that Atlantic Avenue building did not know what their bells were going to become. They could not have known that the work they were doing on hydrophones and oscillators would lead in 2 generations to the technology that won an ocean war and saved millions of tons of merchant shipping and an unknowable number of human lives. They were just trying to make ships safer in fog. The transformation of their work into a weapon happened slowly over 40 years in ways that no individual decision and no individual engineer could have predicted. That is perhaps how most consequential technologies actually arrive, not as the lightning strike of a single brilliant insight, but as the long compounding of careful work that started somewhere modest and ended up somewhere nobody had imagined. Which technology in your own time do you think started out as a bell and is, right now, quietly turning into something else entirely? Let us know in the comments. And if you know veterans or descendants of veterans who served on destroyer escorts in the Atlantic, we'd love to hear their stories. Those men were the ones who actually used the technology this story is about, and their experience deserves to be remembered.